In the novel Life of Pi by Jan Martel, Martel explores the concepts of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis through the character Pi. Sigmund Freud is considered the founding father of psychoanalysis and is extremely well known for his work in neurology. To understand where I will be taking you, you must first understand the basic concepts that Freud created. Freud maintained the belief that there were three fundamental parts of the psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. Each of these apparatuses are present in the novel Life of Pi, specifically when looking at the character Paseen Patel. Towards the end of the novel, Martel presents the readers with a choice. They can either believe that Pi spent his time on the boat with animals or with people. There is a significant amount of literary evidence to suggest that Richard Parker is merely a continuation of Pi's survival instincts. When the entire novel is placed in the context of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, the characters begin to shed new light on the meaning. The id is the personality component made up of unconscious psychic energy that works to satisfy basic urges, needs, and desires. The id is essentially the brain's ancient form of a guardian. The id is responsible for survival. The id regulates food, water, and shelter. It is the brain at its most primitive form and interacts with the ego and superego. The entire basis for the belief that Richard Parker is Pi stems from Pi's retelling of the story to the Japanese investigators. In his new story with humans, Pi includes one less person than animal. After hearing the story with people instead of animals, one investigator exclaims to the other, "So the Taiwanese sailor is a zebra, his mother is the orangutan, the cook is the hyena, which means he's the tiger." This is the most concrete form of literary evidence suggesting the parallel. However, Pi himself does not explicitly say so, and we are left to wonder if Richard Parker was not simply a defense mechanism to justify the extreme cruelty and gore experienced on the lifeboat. The investigator's realization is similar to that of the reader when they are confronted by the fork in the road. If Richard Parker is suddenly Pi's id, then other pieces of the literary puzzle fall into place as well. Take, for example, the moment we are introduced to Richard Parker as the real character on the lifeboat. It is only after Pi nearly drowns that Richard Parker is forced to present himself. After climbing aboard the lifeboat, Pi yells to Richard Parker and throws a life buoy to him in an effort to save him. Once the tiger climbs aboard, Pi shouts to himself, "Hold on tight. I'll pull you in. Don't let go. Pull with your eyes while I pull with my hands. In a few seconds, you'll be aboard and we'll be together." The irony, of course, is that it would be insane to welcome an adult Bengal tiger into the same boat as yourself, being a small human boy. What is important, however, is that during this life-or-death experience, Richard Parker emerges and stays on the lifeboat with Pi. Should Richard Parker be the key to Pi's survival, then it makes perfect sense why Pi would want him now. During part of his voyage, Pi reflects on Richard Parker's influence when he tells the reader that Richard Parker pushed me to go on living. I hated him for it, yet at the same time I was grateful. I am grateful. It's the plain truth. Without Richard Parker, I wouldn't be alive today to tell you my story. Here Pi acknowledges that Richard Parker was influential to his survival. Given Pi's peaceful nature, it makes sense that he was grateful he was able to overcome his past in order to survive. Should you replace the words Richard Parker with my id, the phrase still makes perfect sense. Richard Parker exemplifies the ideas of Sigmund Freud's id. The tiger is responsible for protection, keeping Pi busy while finding food, keeping him company, although that has some contradictory elements to it, and everything else that Pi did to sustain himself. Almost every instance of Pi's instinctual or primitive behaviors can be traced to some root cause relating to Richard Parker. The superego is Freud's second psychic apparatus, which holds a somewhat opposite agenda to that of the id. The superego is a component of personality composed of our internalized ideals that we have acquired from our parents and from society. Pi's childhood is fraught with teachers who have used Pi as a melting pot for their ideas. The internalized ideas that Pi possesses stem from not only his teachers and mentors, but also the culture he was born into. The superego is the morally correct and sound judge of actions. The superego's responsibility is to suppress the goals of the id, and in turn make the ego behave morally rather than realistically. The id and the superego are conflicting forces in the battle of human behavior. Pi's decisions throughout the novel are noticeable results of the superego. Pi has had many childhood experiences which set him in his ways. He works to find a form of faith that is personalized. His meddling with religious diversity is evidence. By taking part in the religions of Hinduism, what he was born into, and then Christianity and Islam, Pi became a very well-rounded religious student. After the respective representatives pay a visit to his father at the family home, Pi admits that all religions are true, I just want to love God. The use of the word love God in the passage sets the tone for Pi's original personality, that of meekness and love. The phrase illustrates Pi's attempt to do good. This meekness comes into conflict after Pi is put into a situation in which he must betray his values to survive. Pi acknowledges that the first time in his life he went fishing was several days into his voyage. The first time that Pi is forced to kill another living thing, these thoughts run through his head. Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Such sentimentalism may seem ridiculous considering what I had witnessed in the last days, but those were the deeds of others, of predatory animals. I suppose I was partly responsible for the rat's death, but I had only thrown it. It was Richard Parker who had killed it. A lifetime of peaceful vegetarianism stood between me and the willful beheading of a fish. This passage shows how Pi's superego is interfering in his decision-making process. Having been a bookish, peaceful, vegetarian schoolboy, killing another animal is a difficult task to complete. This is a prime example of how the id and the superego push and pull each other, and are finally realized in the form of the ego. The superego, of course, based upon Pi's past experiences as a child, is telling him that all life is sacred, and that killing the fish is wrong. However, given the circumstances, Pi's id is telling him that it is necessary for his survival that he take the life of other animals. The compromise he makes between the two will be discussed more in depth when we talk about the ego. Pi also experiences a very influential event when he was fairly young. Pi's father, Santosh, believes that the two boys, Pi and his brother, need to learn a valuable lesson about the zoo animals. Santosh takes him into the tiger cage and allows the starving tiger to devour a live goat before their eyes. Just before the tiger starts eating the goat, Pi's mother ushers the boys out the door, telling Santosh, "They're children, they'll be scarred for the rest of their lives." This passage illustrates how these experiences when Pi was little can affect him long afterwards. This teaching from his father is exactly what the superego is made of, and no doubt part of his father's teaching caused the strong fear of Richard Parker while on the lifeboat. Later, when Pi is thinking of ways to kill Richard Parker, he comes up with the idea of attacking him with all available weaponry. He, or more so his superego, reminds himself that Richard Parker would tear me apart limb by limb, organ by organ. This thought originates from his previous knowledge of the danger of tigers. The lessons he taught are now coming to life, and he has adopted the previous teachings that he acquired from his dad. So now what are we left with? We're left with Pi. Simply Pi. What we see is this feeble, humble, scrawny vegetarian boy, but what really goes on is more complex. We see through the novel the dynamic interaction between the superego and id, mediated and ultimately diffused into what we know as Pi Patel. The ego is defined as the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. The ego prevents us from acting on our basic urges created by the id, but also works to achieve a balance with our moral and idealistic standards created by the superego. Often each decision that Pi makes is a compromise between his id and his superego. The perfect example of this kind of compromise occurs in chapter 61, in which Pi is trying to kill his first fish with the hatchet. Pi covered the fish's head with the blanket and turned the hatchet around. Again my hand wavered in the air. The idea of beating a soft, living head with a hammer was simply too much. I would break its neck, sight unseen, I decided. I wept heartily over this poor little deceased soul. It was the first sentient being I had ever killed. I was now a killer. I was now as guilty as Cain. I was 16 years old, a harmless boy, bookish and religious, and now I had blood on my hands. It's a terrible burden to carry. All sentient life is sacred. I never forget to include this fish in my prayers. What we have here is a compromise. The id knows that Pi must kill the fish to survive, and ideally we'd complete the task with the most efficiency. His superego, however, makes it very difficult for Pi to kill anything, being such a pacifist. Instead of using the hatchet, as the id would do, or not killing the fish at all, as the superego would do, his ego decides to kill it in a manner that will reduce the remorse as much as possible. And of course later, his superego has its way by praying for the fish. This interaction has many complex parts to it, and they include what is moral, what is necessary for survival, what is most desirable, and everything in between. This is Pi.